So what I want to talk about is how do you actually avoid that, and how do you get geared before the mid game, well before that, and how do you survive the early game while still getting geared? And the biggest element to that is picking a good landing zone. So what I've done here is I've gone onto PUBGmap.com, and I've sort of labeled the different what I would consider some of the best possible landing locations on the map. This isn't everything, okay? There are some that I don't have labeled, partly because I want to keep them to myself. I don't want to completely give away all of my favorite landing areas. Then they wouldn't be my favorite landing areas anymore. But you know, this is a good guide for people who are just, you know, trying to get better and trying to survive more of the early game. So what I've done here is I've divided them into 3 different tiers. Green, I would consider the top tier. This orange color I would consider a sort of medium tier, and the red color I would consider sort of the bottom, lowest tier zones. And the way I've ranked these different zones is based on a few different criteria. Okay, when you're thinking about a landing zone, these are the things you should be keeping in mind. Number 1, what is the plane's path? Generally speaking, you want to land as far from the plane path as possible. So if the plane path, we can draw this right here. If the plane path cuts, like, let's say through here, do you want to land? Let's say it starts from here on the west and ends here in the east. Do you want to land right here or right here? Or would you rather land here, or maybe even all the way over here in Severny? You want to land as far away from the plane's path and as late in the plane's path as possible. And the reason for that is simple. You want to minimize the chances of basically having to fight over loot the early game. Okay, this is about how do we win the most games. This is how you do it. You want to land as far away from the plane path as possible, and you want to avoid landing next to other players. And the way you do that is you land away from the plane path and you land late in the plane's path. So those are sort of the first two criteria. Third criteria, and probably one of the most important of all, is vehicle spawns. So when I ranked these, one of the things I was considering, the primary thing I was considering really, is proximity to vehicles. And given that our strategy here is to land in low populated areas, low density areas, you need a vehicle that can get you from one small compound to the next relatively quickly. So if you think about it, if you land somewhere like here, you've got basically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 buildings in this relatively, large area. You've got about 8 buildings. In Georgepol here, you've got 6, 7, 8 buildings just in this tiny block. Okay, so you can get more loot quicker, faster here than you can here. And so to compensate for that, you need to find a vehicle. So finding a vehicle early game is extremely important when you're using this strategy. And it's not just to, get a vehicle and drive to Georgepol, or get a vehicle and drive to Severny. No, we're not doing that, right? Because that's what 90% of the player base does. Either they land in a big populated area, or they find a vehicle and drive to a big populated area. We're not doing that. Okay? So green tier, top tier areas. Let's go over it from left to right here on the map. So this here, north and northwest of Gatka, these are some very lucrative buildings here. You actually have a warehouse here that can spawn military grade loot. You've got 2 really good 2-stories here. You've got a few good 2-stories here, a few here. You've got some here. It's not showing up on this version of the map for some reason, but there are 2 buildings here. I guess this is one of the old versions of the map. There are 2 buildings here. that can spawn decent loot, and this whole compound here has a number of buildings. Vehicles will spawn basically all up and down this road here. So you've got a vehicle spawn right about here. You've got one here. You've actually got a vehicle spawn further down here by these two buildings. You've got a vehicle spawn here. You've got a vehicle spawn here. You've got a vehicle spawn in a garage here. This building here is actually a garage. You've got a vehicle spawn up here on this sort of path here. And there may be other vehicle spawns along the coast here. I think there's a couple on the coast here. I don't land there very often, but you will most likely, 9 times out of 10, you will find a vehicle somewhere along this path. Okay? And that can help dictate where exactly you want to land. But the point being is, you have a very good chance of finding a vehicle here. You've got close access to a handful of buildings that will get you geared, that at least get you started with gearing. And then you can take your vehicle and move to a new location and continue looting. Moving up here, this is another area that most players don't land at. Depending on where you are in the playing path, most players will not land here, but this is another good area. A number of good 2-story buildings here. There's one of the tower buildings here that has pretty decent loot. And like the other zone, there's a number of possible vehicle spawn locations. There's a vehicle spawn location here. There's one by these 2 buildings, this pair of buildings here. You can get vehicles that spawn next to this compound and next to this compound. And you can get vehicles spawn along this sort of dirt path here. You also, if you don't find any vehicles at all, you can get a vehicle spawn here along this main road. And you sometimes get vehicles along this dirt path. And sometimes along this route here heading into Yasnaya. So you have a number of different vehicle spawn locations. Again, this is not an area that people typically land, and you should be able to get yourself relatively well geared. Okay, the next area right here is the southwest Yasnaya. I call this sort of the S-curve. This has an extremely high number of possible vehicle spawns in this little tiny area. You've got like 2 here at the bottom. You've got at least 1 or 2 on this curve. You've got 1 here. And I think there's a possible vehicle spawn up here by this gas station. And this whole zone has really good buildings. A lot of 2-story buildings in this area. It's just really good, and not a lot of people land here. And if you do happen to get in a situation where you want to land there, but other people are landing, you can go for a vehicle and move to a new location if you feel like it's necessary. So this is another good location, and this is relatively close to the center of the map. Both of these locations are relatively close to the center of the map, which really helps. When you have a central circle, it really helps. So finally, in our green tier, and this is all the green tiers right here. You can see they're relatively close to this middle of the map, right? Which is another thing that helps. So this whole zone here, I made it pretty big because there's actually a number of different spots that you can land at. This whole zone, especially these compounds here on the coast, are very rarely hit. I mean, very few people go up here. Now this area is probably one of the weaker of the green tier landing zones because there's really only a couple possible vehicle spawns. There's a garage possible spawn here in this compound. There's a couple vehicles that spawn on the roads here. But other than that, there's not a whole lot. So in terms of vehicles, not great. And it's relatively spread out. But nonetheless, not that many people land here. And if you get a good circle, it's not a huge problem. You can get a lot of good loot just out of these few compounds here. So again, really not bad. So that's our top tier locations. Let's look at the sort of the second tier locations. Again, we'll just kind of go left to right on the map. So this on the far west coast, this is just north. This is a bit northwest of Primorsk. This whole grouping here, this whole cluster of buildings is a good location that doesn't get hit very often. Big downside is that there's really only a couple vehicle spawn possibilities here, and if you don't get a vehicle, you can be you're kind of screwed if you don't get a vehicle spawn. You have a long way to go if the circle shifts hard in the opposite direction. So you have to take that into consideration, but there's a lot of really good buildings here, a lot of 2 stories. I think there's a gas station, there's a tower here. There's a lot you can get just out of this one cluster of buildings. Okay, moving along, we'll hit this here. So this is sort of like the farm, West Multa Bridge area, whatever you want to call it, Multa Bridge, whatever you want to call this area, is generally pretty good. It's pretty dense in terms of the number of buildings. There's good quality buildings here. This zone here in particular, right at the intersection of the Multa Bridge, is really good because there's a couple of different vehicle spawns along this road you can go to, and there's a pretty good number of just solid buildings that you can loot around here. The farm area is also pretty good. There is actually a possible vehicle spawn here in the field, and the buildings closer to the coast are also pretty decent. But again, not the greatest. More people tend to land here because it's close to Multa. And if you get one of these plane paths that cut right through the middle between military and the main island, that you'll get people that try to land here. So you may have to fight some people off. So right next to Multa, there's also Multa Power, or I guess you could call this. I don't know. It's basically between Multa and Multa Power. There's a number of really good clusters of buildings here, and there's a few vehicle spawns along the road, but not great. This is not a zone that I use terribly often, but if I don't have another option, I will land here. But there are some very good buildings in that location. Okay, finally in our tier 2 is this little compound. This is sort of the northwest. I just call it the Northwest Yasnaya compound. Very dense, good quality buildings here. Big drawback though is that there's really only one possible vehicle spawn, like right about here on the west side of it. And if you don't get that vehicle spawn, you have a bit of a hike to get to the nearest one. You might be able to find vehicles down here going down the road, or you might be able to find vehicles along this road going into Yasnaya, but it's pretty risky. Other than that, though, you do get some good buildings out of this. You can get yourself very well geared just out of this little cluster of buildings. Okay, so that basically covers tier 1 and tier 2. Let's look at the tier 3 locations, or the bottom locations, whatever you want to really call it, the sort of last resort spots that I tend to go to. I'll start from the left, of course. So here is one that I've landed at several times before, and I've started, I once considered this a higher tier location to drop at, but I've kind of pushed it down my list because there's really only 2 possible vehicle spawns here, one on this side and one on that side. And if you don't get a vehicle there, again, it's like similar to this location here. If you don't get a vehicle, you have quite a hike before you find the next possible vehicle spawn from this location. But that being said, there's some good 2 stories, and it's relatively dense, so you can get yourself looted pretty quickly. Moving down here, this sort of like triangle here of buildings is pretty solid, actually. There's a lot of loot you can get from these. This one in particular, a lot of 2 stories. This is actually a military warehouse, so you can get some higher tier weaponry out of this warehouse here. Problem is though, vehicles. There's a very low percentage chance of finding a vehicle here. I think there's only really one, and it's like kind of down the road here that you can get, and you may get 1 or 2 vehicles along this road, but they're pretty spread out. and it's a bit of a hike. It's a bit of a hike to get to the next vehicle if you don't find one. So you can get screwed if you don't get a vehicle early. And finally, let's look at the military base. Sometimes you get a plane path that starts like in a really weird location. Like, let's say it goes from here, like down through here. This plane path, right? Like I mean, yeah, if it starts here, you could land in this sort of top tier area, but you're landing really early in the plane path. And like I said, you want to land late in the plane path if at all possible. So, if you want to you want to avoid that if possible. So if you do have to land somewhere on the military island, these two zones here are very rarely hit early game, but they have some good advantages. So these two compounds here and these two compounds here, those two clusters and these two clusters both are pretty good buildings. Not the most dense, but they're decent enough to get good loot. And there's vehicle spawns. There's a couple vehicle spawns in this zone, and there's a couple vehicle spawns on the road here as well. So you have options to get out. Now, if you don't get a vehicle spawn, now you've got a problem, because now you basically have to go up towards the military base in order to find a vehicle spawn. And chances are there's a few heavily armed people in the military base at that point. So you're going to have to fight with them most likely, or you're increasing your chances of having to fight with them to get a vehicle. And then you've got, of course, the obvious problem of if the circle is on the mainland and you're on the military base, you have to either cross the bridge with a vehicle or use a boat, which is not ideal in either case. So anyway, that's sort of it. I hope this has been helpful or informative. I wanted to just do this video because people have been asking me a lot of questions about what makes a good landing zone and what doesn't. Again, just to sort of wrap up, what you're looking for is a landing zone that is away from the plane's path, late in the plane's path, and has good vehicle spawn potential. And of course you want areas that are less populated in the early game, so that you can avoid having to get into fights with people early game. This is really the thing that I think has helped set the foundation for me to be able to get the high top 10 percentage rate that I have of 60 plus percentage top 10 rate, which is really what you need in order to climb the ladder. You need that kind of, it's like that golden sweet spot of 20% win rate, 60% top 10 rate. That's doing this kind of landing strategy is what'll help get you there. So anyway, if you found this helpful, you found this interesting, just leave a comment. And you can also catch me playing PUBG live. You can follow my Twitch link in the description below. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching.